Good afternoon and welcome to our event this afternoon in our People, Politics, and Prose series hosted by Ron Granieri. Today, we're going to be talking about recent world events and how they have affected Germany's stance on military power and Germany's role in the balance between Moscow and the West. And here to do that today are two folks. I can think of no two better people to talk about this topic given their expertise. Besides Ron Granieri, we have longtime FPRI senior fellow Adam Garfinkle. So let me say a few words for those of you who don't know Ron Granieri. He is the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of the West, of America and the West. He's also an associate professor of history at the U.S. Army War College, which also behooves me to do a disclaimer for Ron. Anything he says here will be his personal opinion and does not reflect the views or opinions of the U.S. government, the U.S. Army, or the U.S. Army War College. And before I turn things over to Ron, I'd also like to say a special thank you to our donors and our members for your support. We can't do these events or what FPRI does without you. And if you value what we do, and you're not in one of those categories, members, supporters, donors, please consider joining one of those categories and helping us out. As I'm fond of saying, this content is free to you, but it's not free to us. So we'll also be going to the Q&A about halfway through the program. So please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And you can start doing that right away because I know our host, Ron, often pulls from those questions in the course of the first part of the program. So please go ahead and do that. So take it away, Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri, and all of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Before Vladimir Putin unleashed his new war on Ukraine, Germany had clung to its position as a diplomatic balancer between Moscow and the West, joining in economic sanctions against Russia for its 2014 aggression in Crimea and the Donbass, but downplaying military power in general and claiming that continuing economic ties to Moscow, especially in the shape of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, were a force for peace and a guarantor of Russian moderation. Putin's imperialist war has revealed the shameful naivete, or worse, of this view, and has forced Chancellor Olaf Scholz to recognize a Zeitenwende, or fundamental change in the times. In a speech to the Bundestag 3 days after the war began, Scholz announced plans not only for Germany to aid Ukraine, but also a massive plan to increase German defense spending as a sign of solidarity with Germany's NATO partners, and promised to pursue a greater geopolitical role for Germany within the European Union. Germany has, at last, many people say, embraced, at least rhetorically, the importance of hard power in world affairs, promising to overcome its previous aversion to force and become more active in European security. Or has it? In the weeks since that speech, the Ukrainians have continued to stun the world with their brave and brilliant defense of their homeland. Meanwhile, the Germans have underwhelmed their partners with a hesitant and uneven approach to the practical questions of providing aid, and internal disputes within Scholz's traffic light coalition have raised uncomfortable questions about whether the German political leadership can deliver on its promises at all. Nevertheless, Scholz's grand pronouncement is such a break with the past that it suggests big changes are ahead for the Germans, their neighbors, and their allies. Adam Garfinkle, author of a recent article on the subject in the Cosmopolitan Globalist, joins us today to discuss the meaning and possible consequences of this Zeitenwende. So what has Scholz promised? Can he really deliver? And what will it all mean? These are some of the questions we will address in our conversation with Dr. Adam Garfinkle, who was the founding editor of The American Interest and a former senior fellow here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's also served as principal speechwriter to the Secretary of State, been editor of The National Interest, and has taught at the School of Advanced International Studies, the Johns Hopkins University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Haverford College. A widely published scholar and author of multiple books, including Political Writing, A Guide to the Essentials, and Broken, American political dysfunction and what to do about it. He has received awards from the United States Department of State, the Fulbright Program, the American Academy of Berlin, and elsewhere. And we are delighted to have him with us today. Good afternoon, Adam Garfinkle.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Ron.
So, Adam, we'll jump right in on this question. So, what's the significance of Schultz's promises at the end of February?
Well, I think they're pretty major promises, and you never heard language like that from a German Bundeskanzler, at least not in my lifetime. And what's significant about it is this is an SPD-led coalition with the Greens. In a way, if there had been a CDU Bundeskanzler like Angela Merkel or any of her predecessors, people would have yawned and said, "Oh yeah, just another promise, probably." But the fact that this is an SPD government and a Green government, it's a little like Nixon going to China, really. I mean, only the SPD with a Green facet to its coalition could make statements like this that carry sort of the optic of credibility. Right. It's also, I think, noteworthy that no one in Germany is under any illusions about what's happening in the United States. The dysfunction of our domestic politics and the unpredictability of future foreign policy means that Schultz knew when he made the speech, that he could end up after November with a divided government and a hamstrung Biden administration for 2 years, and then starting in January 2025 with a rerun of the MAGA, America First kind of foreign policy, in which case the Germans would be pretty much alone. Can you imagine what a Trump administration, or something like a Trump administration, with the views that it had about NATO and about allies? Can you imagine what would be the case now had this war begun under such a circumstance? Would the United States have tried to rally the allies? Would there be military equipment flowing to Ukraine? Would there be the kind of sanctions regime that I think the answer to all those questions is clearly no.
Yeah.
So the fact that the Germans they've jumped off the high dive, so to speak, and they're not sure that there's going to be water in the pool in January 2025, but they jumped anyway.
Yeah.
You're right. You mentioned there's been a little bit of some hesitation, some backslash, normal politics in Germany. It would be too much to expect everyone to just get up and salute a change as major as this. But I think it's real. Mm-hmm. The Germans have announced that they want to build their own F-35s. There's going to be a lot of technology transfer between American companies and German government and German companies. There already is, but I mean, there's going to be more, and it's going to take on a slightly different coloration. So I'm persuaded that it's liable to be real. The only thing that's really intervened, and one of the reasons I think you see some of the hesitations and doubts, is Russian military incompetence. For whatever reasons, a combination of poor leadership, low morale, and systemic corruption has made the threat seem a little bit less dire than it did, 52 or 53 days ago, but not much. I mean, the Russians are still, missiling cities as far west as Lviv. Early days. We're still in early days.
Still in early days. Sure.
I think it's after a while, if you've been doing this stuff for as long as I have, and as long as you have, you sort of get a feel for these things. Yeah. It's a little bit like educated intuition. I could be wrong, but you could be wrong. Anybody could be, but it feels real to me.
Well, and this I think is quite interesting, the way that you phrase it, because it is early, so it's hard to say, and who knows what the future will be like. Ironically, when Schultz made the announcement on February 27th, there was the initial belief that the fighting part of the war would be over within a few days. And what Schultz was really talking about was holding NATO together essentially on the border of Ukraine. But what happens when the war continues and the Ukrainians actually succeed in throwing the Russians back? And now the question is, well, how much direct assistance are you going to put into Ukraine? That is a bigger and slightly different question. Yes,
that is a totally different question. Yeah. When I can I just for a minute tell people where this article came from?
Sure.
This is an accidental essay. In the following sense, when I turned 70 in June, I told my associates that I wasn't going to write anymore. because I didn't have a job. I didn't have much prospect of getting a job, and I just couldn't see the point of, keeping up my intellectual infrastructure that enables me to write these kinds of things in return for basically peanut shells, which is what life is like nowadays. It's what the business models are like, unless you're writing for the Atlantic or something. I'm not. So I just stopped. I didn't write anything. And then a friend of mine, the editor of this magazine you mentioned, Cosmopolitan Globalist, wrote me an email and said, I miss your voice, Adam. She's a very sly woman.
I think that is a brilliant way to get somebody to write.
I miss your voice, And I mean, like I say, she's a friend. I want to know what you're thinking. I said, well, all right. You want to know what I'm thinking? I mean, I haven't written, for publication since June, but I have maintained some friendships, some email correspondence with friends and colleagues from before. And there's a particular thread that I have going back and forth with a fellow named Thomas Klein of Brockhoff, who is the head of the German Marshall Fund in Berlin right now, an old friend of mine, somebody I've sort of been through some wars with. I said, I can send you our conversation about this, and you can see what I'm thinking, as long as you promise not to share it with anybody, because don't have Thomas's permission. So she said, sure. And I sent her a couple of conversations, one with Thomas, one with David Brooks on a different subject. So I sent it, say, now you know what I'm thinking, Claire, all right? So she writes back. She's very sly. I have to emphasize just how sly she is. She writes back and she says, look, why don't you let me put together an essay from your conversation with Thomas? You won't have to do anything. I'll do all the work. I'll just put it together and show it to you, okay? I said, look, if you think that's a useful way to spend your time, go right ahead. So a couple days later, I get this relatively short thing, about 1,000 words, and it was terrible, really terrible. In fact, she didn't even distinguish Thomas's remarks from mine, and it was terrible. And I realized later why. So I couldn't let my name go on anything like that, but I didn't want to say no. So what I did was I spent 4.5, 5 hours one day fixing it, turning it into more or less kind of like what you've read. And I sent it back to her. She really went into editor mode. She's really an excellent editor and writer. And she took what was essentially a sloppy, first draft and turned it into a really pretty nice essay. And I fiddled it a little bit, sent it back to her. She posted it within 15 minutes. So I never intended to write this thing, right? So that's what I mean when I say it's an accidental essay.
Well, I mean, we can have a very long conversation about the genius involved with both telling you she misses your voice and then sending you a bad draft, knowing that you would work on it whether you wanted to or not.
She totally got me on this one, And then she tried it again, but I was smarter the second time. And she changed it around a little bit. I mean, let me just tell you what was on my. I mean, the basic conversation that I was having with Thomas was still in February. Mm-hmm. And this process goes on in really the first week in March. So, a lot's happened since. It's been more than a month since then. And all I wanted to point out, really, the main thing I wanted to point out was really a couple things. One, that all the reporting, which is natural, all the reporting on the war was on the immediate, the local, and the emotional.
Right.
And as any historian knows, I'm not an historian, but you are, Ron. As any historian knows, I mean, that's a natural thing, but that's not what wars produce. Nobody who was observing the Battle of the Somme in September 2014 had the slightest idea what World War I would changes it would generate in world politics and European politics. The same as here. So what I was trying to do was step back, get a little less emotional and more analytical, and try to explain to people that the real impact of this war was not going to be on Russia or Ukraine, and it was not going to be local, and it was not going to be mere, even if the war ended relatively quickly, because it really was a Zeitenwende, in the German sense. And also it's not just Germany, there've been major changes in the way in what's been going on in Poland and in China, I would think, for other reasons in other countries. So it's really been a small war so far, but a catalytic war politically. And so that's all I was trying to point out, that the kind of news people were getting wasn't really telling them much about the real consequences, likely impact of the war. That's all I wanted to do. And a couple of other, sort of observations about the nature of the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy, and the nature of the relationship between moral verve in a democracy and the capacity to carry out a sustained values-based foreign policy. That's really all I was trying to do.
Right. Well, and I this is what I've been struggling with too, as I try to analyze this, and so that's why I'm glad we're having this conversation. Is what is fascinating is how assiduously the Germans had avoided this kind of commitment, literally right up until the moment that the Russians invaded Ukraine, right? In fact, the background music coming out of Germany, coming out of Europe before the 24th of February was, please, Russia, just tell us what it is that you want so that we can hurry up and give it to you so you won't invade.
I mean, I have to admit, I was sort of following this, but as a kind of a semi-retired person, I wasn't really assiduous about it. But I mean, like lots of people I know in Europe and in the United States, I didn't think there would be an invasion. I thought it was pretty much a bluff. Yeah. I thought it was an attempt to, sort of like roar and get a little nasty in order to get a concession or two about the status of Ukraine's foreign policy. I thought maybe Putin was angling for something like the Austrian state treaty with respect to something like that. Mm-hmm. And then when the invasion actually happened, I thought to myself, my God, and the reason everybody thought he wouldn't do it was because it would be incredibly stupid. I mean, it's just not that easy for any army, let alone the Russian army, to subdue a country of 42 million people who hate you. All right. It sucked the Russian military dry, destroy elements of the international economy that Russia depends on as much as many other countries. It just seemed like a totally counterproductive thing to do. And then it dawned on me very quickly, this is not in the article, but it dawned on me very quickly that if Putin really wanted to do something, if he wanted to, suborn all of Ukraine or neutralize it, or like take it out of, put it out of business completely, or just seize huge chunks of it, including down along the Black Sea all the way to Odessa and turn it into a landlocked country forever. If you wanted to do something like that, you don't do it when Joe Biden and Tony Blinken are running American foreign policy. You do it when Donald Trump and somebody like that does it, because you wouldn't get the same kind of muscular reaction. I mean, it's really kind of amusing in a way. I mean, Biden, Blinken, our Secretary of Defense, Jake Sullivan, this is like right in their wheelhouse. Yeah. All their lives they've been living and breathing Europe, Russia, NATO. Right. This is what they know. They've done an okay job. They've made a couple of rhetorical errors, I think, but they've done a pretty good job, it seems to me. But this is what they're used to, and you've got a crisis that's right out of central casting. The moral dimension is so clear. Nobody in the United States disagrees that it's a violation of international law and that they're barbarities. I mean, it's so clear. If it had been anywhere else in the world, and if the crisis had been a little bit more ambiguous, there wouldn't be even the amount of bipartisan support for American policy that there is today, and you wouldn't get the kind of response if it had been in Asia, for example, sort of the hub and spoke nature of the alliance system in Asia, as opposed to the full multilateral deal that we have with NATO, would have taken on a very, very different kind of dynamic. So this is kind of perfect, and so but Putin went ahead with it anyway.
Yeah. And of course, that I think is historians, I guess, well, everybody says this, right? History will judge. Well, no, history won't judge, historians will. But that, people are going to be struggling with the question of why did Vladimir Putin decide to do this now? Because certainly the West looked divided over the course of the winter. Yeah. Biden looked weak. And of course, Putin also may have thought that his friends in the West who have been anxious to emphasize the weakness of Biden and the Biden administration, that they may have all made him feel like this would be easy pickings. But that he didn't take the easy thing. He decided to do it the hardest possible way, and he essentially united. As I made a joke, a historian's joke for the audience out here, is that Putin ended up doing the fullWilhelm II, right? As he managed to pull together the whole world against him in a way that people would not have expected. Yeah. By being so clumsy.
Well, I mentioned Kaiser Wilhelm before February 24th when I talked to people about this, because there's a wonderful quote from Robert S. Vansittart, who was the Director General of the British Foreign Ministry back in the 30s in that day, and he wrote a memoir that hardly anybody's read, and it's too bad because it's a great, great memoir. It's called The Mist Procession. It was published posthumously in 1958. But anyway, this is what he said about Kaiser Wilhelm. He did not like war, but he liked doing all the things that led to war. It's a wonderful, wonderful quote. Just captures him perfectly. That's what I thought Putin was doing, right? So me and a lot of other people turned out to be a mistake. But it seems to me, the argument that Putin was basically a shrewd guy playing a weak hand well for many, many years, I don't, tactically, I think that you can credit that argument, But I don't think you can credit strategically, as I put it in the article. And I think something changed. And my Russian friends, I've asked them about this. No one knows, of course, it's all speculation. But some people have argued that, well, maybe he's sick, not necessarily with COVID, but with some other disease, and he's on like a constrained timetable. He wants to be a figure in history, and he needs to do it in a short period of time because he doesn't know if he's going to live long enough to realize his ambition, or something like that. And you've seen the strange behavior with the advisors and sitting at the end of the longest table I've ever seen.
Right.
You need a megaphone to talk to your advisor. I mean, he's acting a little screwy, and he didn't seem to be acting screwy 3 or 4 years ago. So that's the speculation among people who really focus on Russia. Heard Angela Dent say something about that the other day. My friend Lilia Shevtsova told me the same thing. So I don't think he's quite got all of his screws in the right place, which leads to another very important matter. It's not about Germany, but it's about the war. Since you've already taken, I really think probably the shock and awe method of the first couple of days of the. I think Putin was misled, and he probably thought the Ukrainians just going to go, okay, you win, we lay down our arms, no fight. That's what I think he thought was going to happen. Just like, some people in our government thought that was going to happen in the beginning of the Iraq war, and it didn't happen. And just like us, but he didn't have a plan B, really. So.
Yeah, well, heck, I mean, if Putin read the New York Times a week before the invasion, he could read an op-ed by an expert in Ukraine saying that Volodymyr Zelensky was not up to the challenge of his job. And so, and we should all be very modest about our ability to see the future, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's where we get into that interesting question. If once you decide, when you want to threaten war, you can get away with a lot. But once you actually decide to roll the iron dice, you're taking a risk. And clearly, Putin underestimated the risk. I see Tracy Post has a comment here. She says that the most important piece of intel that is needed today is the mental state and mental capacity of Putin. That's a very good question. And I also would say, when do you suppose was the last time anybody ever said to Vladimir Putin, "No, boss, I think you're wrong"?
Yeah, well, it's a shoot the messenger with the bad news kind of a country. It's the same way that China was COVID. I mean, the Chinese government couldn't figure out what the truth was about what was going on in Wuhan for the same reason. I mean, autocratic governments of this character can't tell themselves the truth, right? I think people knew that, but I think what we didn't really get a grip on was just how corrupt, through and through, all the institutions are, and that the military would perform as badly as it did. That was a surprise just about to everybody, I think.
Yeah.
If anybody predicted that ahead of time, I didn't see it.
I didn't see it either, right? In fact, in fact, even in this country, right, we had members of Congress sharing videos of Russian recruits looking all brawny and masculine and criticize and saying that our woke military would crumble in the face of such brilliant hard fighters. And that it turns out that it matters whether people are trained. It matters whether people feel actually like they're fighting for a country that matters to them.
Yeah, and it also matters if the officers and the enlisted men trust each other. I mean, that's critical. I mean, when I saw what was going on in the early stages of this war, things look a little bit different now in Donbass in the east. It reminded me of the performance of Arab armies in 1967 and in other wars in the Middle East, where the average soldier didn't trust the officers, and the officers didn't care about the soldiers, and they just sent them to get butchered, and they stole their salaries, and they didn't give them the guns. They sold them on the black. It's very similar, kind of stories that you hear. And I know more about Arab armies than I know about the Russian army. So it just struck me as very similar. It's
an interesting parallel. Well, and to this larger question about, so what is this that we really are facing? Something fundamentally has changed here, right? Because the fact that Russia has done this means that even if the world is able to reach some kind of mutually agreed upon settlement, that Russia's place in the world, one would argue, has fundamentally changed as long as Vladimir Putin is still around.
Or as long as the regime continues to be a kleptocratic mafia state.
Indeed.
Either with Putin or somebody after.
Either with Putin or with somebody close to him. And so that then we're back to the idea about do these changes that are proclaimed by Schultz, which suggests not only that Germany is going to spend more, which is something lots of people have been asking them to do, but also Schultz makes a point at the end of the speech to say to the Bundestag and to the audience that this is a European issue, and that Germany and we all need to think about what we can do together in Europe. And so does this fundamentally change the nature of not just NATO, but the European Union, right? Those two sibling organizations and how they work together.
That really is the key question. And that's what the essay is mostly about. And of course it's speculative. We don't know how this is going to work out, but it seems to me that one scenario, and I think, again, my gut tells me it's the most likely scenario, is I mentioned before, Germany now has a sense of its own success and virtue over the past many decades. It's not sitting in sackcloth and ashes like it did for many, many years. It doesn't shriek when it looks at itself in the mirror as it once did. And partly this is generational change, birth by birth, funeral by funeral. Partly it's Germany's economic success, but also it has to do with an event that took place with the Syrian refugee crisis back in September of 2015, when Angela Merkel did a very either silly or brave thing, depending on how you interpret it, by allowing all the Syrian refugees to come in unlimited numbers. I was in Germany that week when that train came from Budapest to Munich, and Germans met that train with salt and bread and cheers and welcomes. And it was a really vivid feeling you had in Germany at the time. Here was a total flip on the optic of German memory, where instead of trains leaving Germany through the madness of Germans, sending strangers and Jews and gypsies and socialists and whatever you want out to Auschwitz to be gassed, here was the result of somebody else's madness, in this case, Russian madness in Aleppo and in Syria, bringing people into Germany where they were welcomed as refugees. This made a tremendous difference in the zeitgeist of the German national mind. And these three things together, I think, created in escrow an energy waiting for a moment to spring it. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine did that. And in addition, I think I want to mention, toward the beginning of this whole business, when Putin started with the nuclear threats, moving around nuclear forces, and I mean, here in this country, that was a little bit bracing, but in Germany, it had a whole different meaning, because of the doctrine, the policy of limited war, and then first in a counter value, then in a counter force age. I mean, Germans had a real hard time with the limited warfare idea, because while the idea was we would be more credible in deterring the Russians if we could put a difference between the consequences of a war for our European allies and ourselves. If we could be a little bit safer, we would be bolder. It didn't go over real well in Germany, because they were going to be the victims largely of a limited war. There'd be radioactive corpses from Aachen all the way to the eastern frontier. So in Germany, when those nuclear threats started, banging off the wall, they really got a deja vu rocket rattle, and that made a huge difference in how they verved up and how the response came. Seems to me. I also want to mention, back to the reason why I think this really is a sea change, largely in Atlantic security relations, and hence in Europe, both economically and in terms of security policy, is that, as I mentioned in passing a moment ago, for a democracy, for a liberal democracy to have an active, benign, sustained, and successful foreign policy, it has to have a sense of its own virtue. There has to be a reason why you sacrifice, a reason why you organize, a reason why you trust leaders to do things that could be in the world very dangerous. Now, the Germans have just acquired that formula, where they have a sense of themselves that is no longer one of abashed shame. They feel a lot more confident, and they now have the moral, social basis to go out in the world and be, what people have called a normal country. And the Germans are gaining that sense, just as the United States is losing its sense. Right. I think the troubles we have in this country, and the troubles we have had and will continue to have in foreign policy, have a lot to do with this fact that we don't think we are. Many people do not think we are a virtuous society anymore. It's not just that we're divided, as everybody can see. It's that we don't think we're virtuous anymore. In the Trump period, the whole idea of American exceptionalism was thrown overboard as like a used cigar butt. Right, America just like every other country, kind of thing. Randian morality, just like everybody else. All zero-sum stuff. Winners and losers only. That kind of thing. the United States is a covenantal country. It's based on ideas about life in the public realm, and really, the covenant is between these ideas and the society, not the state. All right. When you lose that sense of covenantal obligation and trust at this level, you don't educate in terms of civics, and you can't sustain a foreign policy that's active and that's ambitious and that's aspirational. Can't do it. Right. So that's why I think what's likely to happen over the next, it'll take years, 5 years, 6, nobody knows. It kind of depends on how the war proceeds, what happens in Russia as a result. But it seems to me that what I consider to be the unnatural extension of American military power into the very heart of Europe, into Eurasia, that's about to be rectified. And it's likely to be rectified under German leadership. Now, what that's going to mean in terms of the EU, how the Germans and the French and the British and the Italians and the Swedes and others, how they're all going to put this all together, nobody really knows. But I think that's the order of the game that we're going to see over the next several years. Well,
and that's what I think is a very interesting paradox in that, first of all, right, can we in the United States, can we both, or can any country, can any society be honest about its failings and yet still be committed to its ideals? Right? Can they be honest about the meaning of those ideals and be willing to pay a price in support of those ideals? Right? We've done a lot of this, and a lot of the politics of the last, say, 10 years in the United States has been a backlash against the sort of excessive efforts. But if we don't completely lose that sense, that if we're true to the idea that the goal has always been to encourage the Europeans to develop into a partner that can stand on its own 2 feet and can work with the United States, but no longer rely solely on the United States. I mean, there are some people who've been wanting the Germans to do this for a lot longer, but if it's happening now, that's a good thing. But let me throw one. Oh, go ahead, Adam. I'm sorry.
We said go back to the Mansfield Amendment, for God's sake. That was 1972. We said for years that we wanted the Europeans to do more, but then we didn't let them.
We didn't let them. No, that's exactly right. We've always pulled back.
Control freaks. We've always been control freaks with respect. We infantilized their foreign policies. Only the British or the French had post World War II, great power traditions. Right. But even those atrophied to some extent. First in France and then in Britain. Right. But one of the reasons we couldn't just let the Europeans just do whatever they wanted was because they didn't have a natural leadership quorum. They were fractious. They didn't agree. They had, again, in Germany, back to Germany, you had the Russlandverstetten types, those who understood Russia. You mentioned this with Nord Stream and so on.
Yes.
They were functionalists. They really thought, it was a little bit like, that famous book before World War I that said that war was obsolete. Well, they really were functional. They really thought that, if you traded with the other side, and you were nice to them, you smiled a lot, and you invested in their economy, there would be no war. It was very naive. Functionalism is one of the silliest ideas that otherwise serious people have ever entertained. It doesn't work that way. Politics is an autonomous province. It's not an extension of economics, right? Karl Marx notwithstanding. But so you have a different in German politics too. One of the things so fascinating about this coalition is both the SPD and the CDU are pay-to-play political parties. They are very solicitous of the large German corporations, certainly the car manufacturers in Bavaria, but others as well. Okay, and is that corruption? No, it's just the way that modern capitalism, capitalist economies work in democracies, even fairly well institutionalized democracies like Germany. Now, what's interesting is that the SPD is part of this, not as much as the CDU, but the SPD, but the Greens really aren't. The Greens are kind of a couple of steps away from this pay-to-play stuff with the German corporations. That's why it's so interesting to see the heightened role of the Greens in all this. I mean, they started out as just an environmental party. They're far from that now, and it's just a very interesting combination we see.
They start out as a party that was explicitly hostile to NATO.
Yeah.
And in the last 5 years, right, they became the most reliable supporter of transatlantic connections.
That's right.
And Annalena Baerbock as foreign minister, right, somebody with no previous experience really, she has embraced this notion of leadership. One could argue she's been more explicit and aggressive and idealistic in her rhetoric than Chancellor Scholz.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, well, I'm going to get the economic question because I see Charles Burhan asked two questions. And I want to sort of put them together because one of the reasons why the Germans, they are reluctant to take certain steps, like reluctant to embargo Russian oil and gas, is because they don't want Germany to fall into recession. And they feel like, that they can do a lot of other things, but they can't destroy their own economy. And yet, so we have this question of, if the war is going to harm the German economy anyway, will that ultimately undermine any German efforts to stand up to Russia at all? And what does Germany have the economic confidence and sense of itself to be engaged in a long-term plan to support and help rebuild Ukraine?
Great questions. I wish I knew the answers. I really don't know I'm not a world-class expert on German politics. I know a little bit about it. It seems to me that sure, if the German economy goes into the crapper, so to speak, to use the scientific term, it's going to put a real crimp on a lot of plans to spend money and do a lot of things. But I think more important than that, it's the survival of the coalition. All right, and don't on Sunday coming up, there's going to be the runoff election in France, and I think most of the smart money thinks Macron will win, but people are a little nervous. I read somewhere that the French are always grumpy, but now they're angry. And Marine Le Pen might win. If that could happen in France, the AfD is there in Germany. Recessions are not good for liberal politics in Europe. I mean, it's the history of it, as you know. Not easy to predict with the Russians screwing around, supporting these various kinds of parties sub rosa as they've been doing. It's very hard to predict, what German politics will look like in 5 or 6 or 7 years. I mean, remember in January 1929, a lot of people thought that just about everything was impossible that happened by January 1939. Yeah. So again, early days.
Well, and I have to say my contemporary historian hat on here is that the last time there was this big a shift in German foreign policy was in 1999, when the Germans were willing to go along with NATO's war in Kosovo. And that was also a red-green government with Joschka Fischer as foreign minister and Gerhard Schröder as chancellor. And at that time, several people pointed out that, that you made the point that you made earlier, that sort of only Nixon can go to China, that a red-green government was willing to engage in NATO out-of-area activity. If they hadn't been in government, if it had been Helmut Kohl and the CDU who had done it, the Greens and the Social Democrats would all be marching against it.
That's right.
So so it worked out quite well, one could say, for NATO, and so that's happening here too. But what we need to remember is that the back then, a lot of Social Democrats and a lot of Greens ended up very uncomfortable with this level of commitment to an aggressive foreign policy. And by 2002, they had fallen back into very heavily anti-American, anti-NATO tones as part of Schroeder's reelection campaign in 2002. So this is where, when we think about, it's really something to see a young leader like Annalena Baerbock or her co-leader of the Greens, Robert Habeck, taking the positions they are here. They are clearly out in front of a lot of their voters. And the question is, will they be able to bring their voters along? And one could say that Schultz has been so nervous in part because it's pretty clear he's not comfortable being this far out in front of his voters.
And a lot of it does depend on the economy. I mean, they're being leaders is what they're being, which is a nice thing to see. Right. But in order to be followed, they're going to have to provide the goods. And that's why that's one of the reasons they're being so reluctant about the oil and gas. I mean, really, if I'm sure that the planners have doped this out, and they've projected what the next winter is going to look like. And if this war goes on for too much longer, for another couple of months, as is quite possible, I mean, you're looking at pretty serious economic disruption. And it's not just you have to follow it through. When energy inputs become scarce and prices go up in energy inputs, it affects the entire economy. Yes, produces inflation. Germans don't like inflation. They learned the hard way what that does to politics. So a lot of ghosts are rising. All right, in the memories here, and that's why I think that explains a lot of the nervousness and tentative, second thoughts we've seen. But I think they're committed to the basic path. One other thing could throw a monkey wrench in this whole business, and that is, I mean, let me just start from the back. Bill Burns the other day mentioned in a rare speech the possibility of nuclear weapons use, theater nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. So it wasn't just a brash scare tactic of Putin, but the possibility that he might actually, if he's cornered, might start with chemical weapons. If he doesn't get a substantial pushback on that, might escalate to so-called battlefield or tactical or theater nuclear weapons. I have been worrying about this from the start, because I stand on the premise that the guy is not entirely in his right mind. We talked about this a few minutes ago. So I don't discount the possibility. And the question becomes, what do we do?
What do we do
if he does that? Okay. And there have been some pretty substantial essays written on this. My friend Steve Rosen published one on the Bulwark not too long. There've been other people who've written about it, and I'm sure in the government people are thinking about this, but there's no easy answer to what you do. It seems to me the trick right now is you've got to deter Putin's any supposition that might come into his head that he could prevail at anywhere up the escalation ladder. So you've got to be tough enough and ballsy enough to match him, slap for slap. But accidents happen, right. Miscalculations happen, crazy people do crazy things. We're really, I think, at a very delicate time. The trick is to leave a window open, right? Mm-hmm. There is a time and a place for creative American diplomacy to negotiate this war down to something that, isn't so dangerous, but the timing has to be right. Putin has to be persuaded that he can't win on the conventional level, that he can't take Odessa, for example, that he can't sustain having taken the Donbass, and that he can't profit from using weapons of mass destruction of any kind. That's a tricky balance. Right. And to me, the Biden administration has done pretty well. I think they made 3 mistakes so far. Let's just go over them very quickly.
Okay.
When Biden said, when he was in Poland, not 1 inch of NATO territory, right? When you say to the Russians, this is ours, and then you say what you're not going to do, it means that everything that's not ours is going to be is theirs. It's sort of like Dean Acheson's news conference that led to the Korean War, right? You never say what you're not going to do. You just leave that ambiguous. Right. Let the other side worry about what you're not going to do. That's a first mistake. Second mistake we all know is he went off script and said that this man should not be allowed to right. The scuttlebutt in Russia is that Putin pushed aside Medvedev after Gaddafi was killed in that hole in Libya, because he was worried that was going to happen to him. If that's what he's worried about, not unrealistically in my view, then you don't force him back against the wall without that open window. And then the third thing that I think people in general have been mistaken about, I may be wrong about this, but my instinct is that after what happened in Bucha, after the discovery of all the mass graves and the executions and the true barbarity, the right thing to have said was not, oh, let's have a war crimes trial, not to label Vladimir Putin a war criminal, because again, you're shutting off his options. It seems to me that the smarter thing to have said would have been, there clearly have been violations of military conduct and the rules of civilization and war on the part of the Russian military, and we wish to hold responsible those in the Russian military and in the Russian government to bring people who have or are guilty of these violations to justice. That way, we wouldn't be blaming Putin directly, wouldn't be personalizing.
It would give him an opportunity to blame these mistakes on somebody else.
That's right. But the point is, there has to be an open window somewhere for this man to climb out of. Right. Because if you push him into a corner and he thinks he's going to lose, the likelihood that he'll use a nuke goes much higher, and that puts us into a very difficult position. We can't do nothing. Right. We can't not respond. We have some conventional military options of taking out Russian installations with conventional forces. But I mean, there are no good answers if you use.
Well, because the sad thing is any attack after the use of a weapon of mass destruction, any attack on a Russian facility, until the explosion happens, the Russians may just assume that it is an attack with equal weapons.
That's right. Well,
yeah,
and we're going to kill Russians on Russian soil.
Right, which is an escalation nobody wants.
Yeah. So. Right. That's really where we are. It does have something to do with Germany, because if the war really goes south like that, okay, what the consequences will be for American politics. I mean, let's just an aside. There's been a semblance of bipartisan support for the Biden administration. A lot of Republicans have gone along with it. The Putin wing of the Republican Party is not in step with public opinion. We know that. But look at the actions that have been taken. Yeah. They've all been executive orders. They've all been done by the White House. The Congress hasn't done anything. The Congress hasn't even gotten its act together to pass a non-binding resolution condemning the war. Congress hasn't done a thing. So you don't want to exaggerate how much bipartisan comity there is right now, because the Congress has been dysfunctional.
Right, especially with midterm elections coming up, and there's no premium on cooperation.
So if something goes wrong, and something goes wrong, really wrong in the war, as the way I've just described it, I am quite sure that the Republicans who've been, marking public opinion and saying, "Okay, Joe," will turn against the Biden administration immediately and blame it for partisan purposes, and then that'll be the end of any imitation by bipartisanship here.
Right.
So the course of the war, and just how much it could conceivably escalate, affects everything. It affects American policy. It affects what the Germans are thinking and doing. And the Poles. It affects everything.
Everything. So one comment I see from David Carl asked the question: are Ukrainian pipelines still carrying Russian gas to Germany? The answer to that question is yes. The irony is that in some cases, at least until very recently, the Ukrainians were still getting paid for it too, because for pipelines that transit Ukraine. So somehow, in a weird way, right, the continued purchase of Russian gas by Europeans has been putting money in the pockets of both the Russians and the Ukrainians.
This reminds
which is crazy.
Any historian knows that in June 1941, right on the eve of Operation Barbarossa, there were still the trading relay. The trucks were still crossing the borders in both directions. The same thing.
Same thing. Yeah, that's where you talk about how politics and economics are separate things. But Tom Trop asked a question that touches on something you already mentioned, and that is when we think about how does this end? How is this likely to end? And the short answer is, who the heck knows? But it is likely that it ends with some sort of a negotiated agreement, right? But at what stage does it come? And what should the role of outside forces be? If the fighting is between Russians and Ukrainians, what role does the United States? What role does China? What role does any third party? We know that early in the war, the Israelis, for example, tried to explain their deeply ambivalent attitudes by claiming that they were going to help mediate. We could talk about that. That's a whole different discussion, I suppose. But is there anybody who can mediate, or what would mediation even look like?
Well, it seems to me that the United States, as the head of NATO, would have a seat at the table.
Right.
And we can do what the Israelis can't do, right? Or nobody else can do. We can actually make a difference as reality,
right,
breeds against these countries. No other country, not even China, has a kind of suasive power and material impact on both sides that we can have. Right. So clearly, we will be there. There are all kinds of things you could do in the context of a negotiation. But I would say this: the Ukrainians, if there's a negotiated end to the war, and I hope that's the way that this war ends, the Ukrainians are not going to get everything that they deserve, and they're not going to get necessarily everything that they need. They're going to still be exposed to a great deal of risk, no matter in all kind of imaginable outcomes of a negotiation that you could think of. So it's just one of those situations where the best of all worlds and the worst of all worlds are kind of mixed up into the world that we have. Mm-hmm. So they're not going to get what they deserve. They're not going to get justice for what they've suffered. But Zelensky and the rest of the Ukrainian government are going to have to swallow real hard and realize that it might be the best they can get. And what would that entail? Well, from a territorial point of view, I can imagine a situation in which some kind of an autonomy regime for the Russian-speaking areas of the Ukraine is negotiable. Mm-hmm. Frankly, after what we've seen, some people wonder whether Kiev actually wants these places back at all, but I think probably they do. The idea of Ukraine as a landlocked country with Odessa in Russian hands, that's really off the table. That can't be. But you could imagine, short of an Article 5 or NATO membership, you could imagine going back to the sort of partnership for peace. You could also imagine an associate relationship with the EU, the kind that Norway has right now. Mm-hmm. So you could buck up the Ukraine and allow it to face West, both in security terms, imperfect, and in economic terms, imperfect. That might be good enough, all right? And then of course, you would say, well, why would the Ukrainians trade anything to the Russians? and not get the kind of guarantee that could prevent another Russian attack against them. Well, I don't know, but if Putin wants to do the same thing again, right, then he's even nuttier than he was the first time, than he was on February 24th. It seems to me that the Russians have learned a certain lesson about Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian heroism, and their willingness to really take a lot of lumps in defense of their country. They didn't just lie down after the first 48 hours. And I think boy, if Putin were full or some successor were foolish enough to try the same sort of thing again in a couple of years, that would surprise me.
It would surprise. I mean, because once again, right, nothing, after something happens, it then forms the basis of everybody's historical memory of what could happen and what's likely to happen. As some people point out, right, that if your image of invading Russia was Napoleon in 1812, then you would never invade Russia. But if your image of invading Russia is Germany in 1917, then the Germans might actually get the idea that Russia could be conquered, which leads to the Germany of 1941, which was a disaster.
Right.
So these things shape your experience.
Or that Russian politics could be rubbled. All right, in which case you can have your way with them as they struggle to put together some kind of a government. Another question that arises here. I mean, Putin's very popular in Russia.
He is.
Of course, you don't know what Russian polls really mean, but it's pretty clear that a lot of Russians are behind him. I think they buy the Nazification stuff, even though Zelensky's a Jew, which is one of the weirdest things, frankly, that I've had to try to wrap my head around. Really hard to wrap my head around is the fact that here's a guy, a comedian who puts a television show about his becoming prime minister. And in episode 20, I don't know if you've seen this thing, Servant of the State. You really got to watch it if you haven't seen it. In episode 23, there is this phantasmagorical encounter between Zelensky and Ivan the Terrible. All right, in episode 23. And Ivan the Terrible is this huge, 6'40" guy, and they're having this discussion. And Ivan the Terrible says, "Oh, you are in trouble in Ukraine. Are the Lithuanians and the Poles oppressing you?" Right? This goes back to the 15th. So we will come and we, Slavic brother, we will come and save you from the terrible Poles and Lithuanians. Zelensky says, no. Our paths have to part. We want to look west. All right. And Ivan the Terrible grabs Zelensky by the collar and knocks him silly. This was filmed in 2015. This is about as prophetic, you say life imitates art. Well, this is one heck of an example, but it's twice that, because he actually gets elected. He gets elected on the basis of this ridiculous. On the basis
of this show.
When has anything like that ever happened, Ron?
It is. Kevin Kline was not elected president after making Dave. And so now I think about this and so many things that have happened with regard to this war were completely unpredicted and unpredictable. And so I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions, but Tracy Post and a few other people in the comments have mentioned that thinking about the future here is, will we see institutions somehow emerging strengthened from this, right? Tracy Post asks, will the Germans really think in European terms rather than individual national terms? And one could also argue, we throw in the question of, what happens after the French vote? Are we reaching a new period where Europeans will actually be thinking in European terms, or is this just it's just a talking point now, and they'll go back to disagreeing about everything?
Well, they're going to disagree about a lot, but let me put it this way: this is more likely now than it has been in my lifetime. It is more likely. Whether it will actually happen depends on a whole raft of contingent decisions that have yet to be made. But the door is open now to this. All right. The British role is actually very important. Britain, of course, is no longer in the EU, but it's still a major power, and it's got military might, and it's a kind of offshore balancer to Europe, like in the old days, But now it's a political balancer. Yeah. Assuming that the French elections don't get really weird on Sunday, what you have is a kind of rolling dialectic among several major countries, which could soon include Sweden and Finland in this mix. And it's going to take a couple of years for it to roll out. By the way, just I was thinking the other day about the famous Chicken Kiev speech.
Yes.
Of 1991. Now, of course, that was something that Brent Scowcroft thought up, that Condoleezza Rice wrote, and that George H.W. Bush delivered, and to a great deal of embarrassed horror.
Embarrassed horror. There you go. That's a good word for it. Yes.
But Scowcroft was no fool. Actually traveled to him with Russia once and got to know him pretty well. He was no fool, and he simply was expressing the historical insight that if you have lots of little new countries, you're going to have a shadow belt of instability around an old empire, and it's going to go on sometimes for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Now, if the Soviet Union had not broken up, or if Russia had been reconstituted in such a way as to have a different kind of relationship with Ukraine, and if we hadn't expanded NATO to up their nostrils just about, you could imagine a whole different scenario right now. It wouldn't have been a war. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now there's a price for Pax Romana, Pax anything, and the price is the suppression of weaker powers, right? Mm-hmm. You take your ticket, you take your chances. What depredations and what bad things do you want to choose, right? But clearly, the Balkan Wars, what I call the wars of Yugoslav succession, the bad as they were, they didn't spill over any boundary. All right, no. They stayed within it wasn't a catalytic war. This could become a catalytic war, and it's a function of the shadow belt that was created from the dissolution of the empire, the Soviet Empire, and people with an historical sense have to be adults about this. Everything involves a trade-off, sometimes played out over many years, and this is one that's playing out now that started back in 1991. The way it goes.
We're still trying to figure it out 30 years after the end of the Cold War. There were works that talked about how the collapse of the Soviet Union was so fascinating because it was the first time a major power had collapsed to that extent without starting a war. So perhaps what we're seeing now is a sort of regression to the mean, that this is the war that we were going to get sooner or later.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so what happens next? Who knows? People watching this video, people watching it right now as we're speaking, none of us know what will happen later. People who watch this later on YouTube can tell us what we got right and what we got wrong. And perhaps in the future, we can bring you back, Adam, to talk about these things some more. But would you believe it? We have just about talked up an entire hour on this stuff.
Oh, last comment,
please.
All of this stuff is speculative,
right?
But it's important to get heuristic about these things, because as I said in the beginning, it's easy to drown in the immediate, the emotional, the telegenic. That's okay for most people, but it's not okay for us. I mean, people like us, people who have been blessed with an opportunity to get an education and who've been lucky enough to live as long as we have an obligation to think about these things, to project out. It's not, you don't expect to be right all the time. What you expect is to be able to pose the right questions that may allow over the course of time other people to be right. That's how I think of it.
I think that's an excellent. I fully endorse that outlook, and of course that's what brings us together for events like this to talk about them here at FPRI. Adam Garfinkle, thank you so much for joining us on People, Politics, Prose. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, Ron.
And thanks to all of you for joining us. Right, I hope that you have enjoyed this particular conversation. If you have, I hope you will tell a friend, and that you will bring a friend next time to come to future events for FPRI. Please consider supporting this effort by becoming a member or partner of FPRI. There are details in the chat, but you can find out more about People, Politics, and Prose and about other programs at FPRI by visiting our website, fpri.org. Follow us on Facebook, friend us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. We really do hope to be able to welcome you to future events. Until next time, for everybody at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.